Hello and welcome to my review of The Dawn Attack by Brian Callison. Callison was a prolific author in the 1970s and was still active into the early 2000s. Dawn Attack was his third book. It came out in 1972 and is set during the Second World War. Dawn Attack covers the various characters on both sides of a 1941 commando raid on occupied Norway. In 1941, the United Kingdom was alone in Europe post the retreat from Dunkirk, and the commando raids across Europe were an important part of keeping morale up at home as well as keeping the Nazis on their toes. What's strange about this book is that it is a fictional raid. In modern times, I think that would probably raise more eyebrows than it did in 1972, because I think in more modern times people prefer research and real to mere verisimilitude. Though one, of course, could raise questions about the truthfulness of some of the stories told about real incidents, especially when Hollywood gets involved. So Callison's intent is as a minimum to entertain, but as we will see, he does do a bit more than that. The opening handful of pages introduces a variety of characters, British and German, as a joint task force sails from Britain towards the Norwegian town of Alvik. While interesting and well executed, this section doesn't explain the purpose of the raid until about page 40, when Callison says that the town has a newly installed antenna being used to spy on British North Sea shipping. Additionally, the town hosts a fish oil factory, and fish oil is used in the manufacturing of coolant for German aeroplanes. So it's a handy target, but by far the most interesting part of the early section is the various introductions to the characters and their building nerves as they approach their target. Callison absolutely knows what he's doing here, to the extent there's almost a touch of cynicism in pairing the stories of Lieutenant Commander William Bradbury and the commando Arthur Henderson. Bradbury is the aloof commander, beloved by his men for his unbreakable coolness. He's introduced with an anecdote about how he was detailed to welcome a visiting MP to his ship. An unexpected air raid and a near miss from an exploding bomb launched the arriving MP into the Scottish harbour and deprived him of much of his clothing. An unruffled Bradbury fished him out of the water and asked, "But apart from that, sir, did you have a jolly good trip out from the pier?" Henderson's story is longer and of striking contrast. Returning from Dunkirk to his family, Henderson is in time to see a German bomb land on his home and wipe out his wife and children. His daughter Barbara is identified only by being smaller than the incinerated teddy bear she was hugging, but he never found little Tommy at all. The ARP blokes did later, of course, though they wouldn't let him see what was in the pathetically small ground sheet. He didn't argue very much with them, not having been standing there watching blindly for 16 eternal hours, but he did have to know that there wasn't any hope left to cling to. The triple adjectives play up Tommy's lack of size and therefore his innocence. While by using this perhaps a little unidiomatic bean, Callison can use three present participles, having, standing and watching, to play up the immediacy, the now, even among Henderson's recollection. Compared that to not after he stood there and watched blindly for 16 eternal hours. However, Henderson's tug on the reader's heartstrings is all the more powerful for coming on the heels of Bradbury's more humorous anecdote, likely the most light-hearted of the novel, which also chooses as its target the ridiculous figure of the umbrella-toting MP whose unnecessary visit is holding up the warship's departure. There's a similar contrast later when the German commander, a veteran of the First World War, is portrayed as out of touch. His subordinate dislikes working for him and observes, "You had to hate an officer to really admire him," while Rome, the officer himself, is thinking that his softly approach is winning his troops over, and he thinks, "You had to like an officer to really admire him." When the fighting begins, Callison repeats this word-for-word attribution in the quote he uses to begin each chapter. Chapter 4 has this as its header: Geneva Convention, shit, let's hit the bastards hard, then keep on kicking them while they're down. And that's attributed to an unknown leading seaman, HMS Hystrix. Chapter 5 begins with this: Geneva Convention, shit, let's hit the bastards hard, then keep on kicking them while they're down, which in this instance is attributed to an unknown German soldier from the Wehrmacht's Army Corps, clearly intending to portray the men on both sides as identical. This is slightly undone because although there are a number of Germans woven in amongst the British characters, and Callison's introduction insists that there was a distinct attempt to portray both sides of the campaign, tentatively I offer this novel as a tribute to all of them, raiders and defenders. With a smattering of exceptions, the British are a resolute bunch, battling hardship and harbouring grudges such as Henderson's for Nazi slights. On the other hand, while there are certainly competent men among them, all the neurotics, idiots, cowards and gays are on the German side. The latter would almost certainly not appear in the 2020s equivalent of this book. So if you prioritise LGBT representation in what you read, then this is probably not the book for you. Everyone else, though, is liable to get something from this book. The battle, when it begins, encapsulates air, sea and ground forces, and there is, among a whole raft of characters, good consistency and development. Henderson's grudge wavers as he realises the men he's fighting aren't so different from him. The experienced men who have seen it all before handle it with a degree of unflappability, while others handle it less well, such as the German cycling through a naval bombardment, warning his fellows that it is an air raid. He later returns, shell-shocked and still muttering the same warning, even when surrounded by British soldiers. Cinephile Kruger's war is interrupted whenever possible by his love of Errol Flynn movies, and as Callison returns to him, he finds him comparing his experiences with that of the movie stars. It is this consistency throughout characters that allows them to be a touch more than one-note figures, and also helps the reader remember who is who in a novel as crammed as this. But Kruger experiences something Flynn does not, the business end of a destroyer's broadside. Sitting howling like a mad dog with the blood pouring down his shattered eardrums and freezing in black rivulets down the side of his shocked face. They didn't show that either, not on a cinema screen, which, as you can tell, also allows Callison to discuss, in a book focusing on the individual and collective heroism of war, to criticise how pointless it all is. No more overtly than when the German air raid warning drives their defenders away from their posts and into their bunkers, a move which is obviously advantageous to the British advance. But all that did was to prove that war is just a series of little mistakes which, when joined together, make the biggest mistake of all. The fighting when it starts is fragmented by covering both sides and all three types of military and the various objectives. While that does lend itself to mirroring the choppy and disjointed nature of the battlefield, there is, if I have to be critical, a danger of losing sight of the whole and reducing it to a string of anecdotes. The second half of the book is almost entirely fighting, but only occasionally, despite the death toll, does it raise the pulse rate in the same way as Steel Helmet by Charles Packman, which is reviewed on this channel. Callison's writing style relies heavily on ellipsis, and this passage of a chain-smoking captain, half speedburger, all puff puff puff, would probably be left to a text for a far younger audience than this one. This depiction of a motorcycle crash contains 3 ellipses too, and this horrible part at the end, which might have worked better if the novel was narrated in the first person, which it clearly isn't. The Norsk Hotel flashed past like the stately erect lances, reflecting the beam of the headlamp. The patch of frozen, burnished snow at the bottom of the dip reflected the glow too, but by the time he had seen it and throttled back, it was far too late for the corporal to do anything other than stamp involuntarily on the motorcycle's footbrake pedal. Though at any speed above a crawl, it is most inadvisable to do anything other than pray when you're already broadsiding down a glassy, frictionless bitch of a hill. This second-person pronoun direct address, if you prefer, doesn't really work in making this more immediate or allow for an author describing a hill using the expletive, partly because the rest of it doesn't have that urgency. If you want to use the pronouns to hook in the reader, one simply isn't enough. Though when you're already broadsiding down a glassy, frictionless bitch of a hill, there really isn't much you can do but pray. 2 is better than 1, but it still might be better to rework this passage for a third. All the best things come in 3s. But the whole passage is too long-winded to create any urgency. Callison throughout probably overdoes the adjectives and adverbs, but here it is especially to his detriment. The whole thing needs tightening. The patch of ice glistened in the glow too, but before he'd even seen it, it was too late. You can stamp down on the brake, but when you're already broadsiding down a glassy hill, there is nothing you can do but pray. You can see I've brutalised the adjectives here. The scene already being set elsewhere in the chapter makes them unnecessary, but just where I can use one word instead of 3 or 4, I have done so to get things more punchy, so by the time he'd see it becomes before he'd seen it. With that established, we can say too late instead of far too late. We want shorter, snappier sentences to try and get our reader to read through more quickly, to feel that urgency. We don't need glassy and frictionless. What does one say that the other doesn't? And personally, my narrator in the third person would never swear. Regardless, bitch of a hill is just more unnecessary information, so I've stripped it down, and though I don't think I'd use the second person here, Callison did, so I've tried to make more of it. The triple U rather than his single use might help put the reader into the doomed corporal's seat. Generally, however, Callison's characters are strong, the novel action-packed after a suspenseful countdown to the beginning of combat, and far more of Dawn Attack works than doesn't. For me, the biggest disappointment is that in a novel so focused on the people, he includes a free Norwegian squad returning to combat on the homeland but does so little with them. For readers in Britain and America, we never experience being driven from our homeland by invaders, or the emotions that must cause when returning to perform violence. And while I'd like to have seen more done with that side of things, overall The Dawn Attack is a very strong war book. My books, the science fiction comedies involving Professor Sexton Lovecraft, are available for your Kindle wherever you happen to be in the world. There's a link in the description. You can search for my pen name Brent Seagull on eBay if you want a paperback. Thanks for watching, like and subscribe to help the channel out.